You may be seated. How to choose from among those simple, lovely readings today. We don't get many L.L. Bean catalogs in the mail anymore at our house. One cheer for the internet, I guess. The last time one arrived, it brought to mind the days when we seemed to get 6 or 7 every week. What hasn't changed over the years, though, is the somewhat narrow display of diversity on their pages. There are people of different ethnicities, people of different skin color, different hair texture, but everybody's wearing L.L. Bean clothing, and their clothing's all roughly the same size. Not only is everybody wearing L.L. Bean clothes, pitching L.L. Bean tents and relaxing next to L.L. Bean canoes, they're also all wearing the same pleasant smile, the smile of a well-adjusted, middle-class American, an unpretentious lover of the outdoors who's as comfortable in his own skin as he is his chinos, flannel shirt, sensible shoes. Sometimes the word diversity conjures up an L.L. Bean catalog for me. It can suggest just the mildest and most inoffensive sorts of differences among people whose children are all perfectly content playing with seashells on their manicured lawns and whose golden retrievers never shed or soil the carpets. So you might wonder what would happen to us if on page 47 of the next L.L. Bean catalog, rather than a pleasantly proportioned woman in plaid pajamas and wicked good slippers, we found an ancient Hebrew named Job, sitting in ashes, finding a little relief from his suffering by scraping his arms with a broken potsherd. It would be a little strange, right? There's no sackcloth in the fall collection this year, I'm told. But wouldn't the actual diversity of the catalog go a little deeper if he were actually there? Job seems almost as out of place in a church, too, doesn't he? And it's not just his frightening appearance that's unsettling, which was described in uncomfortable detail last week. It's that Job's faith doesn't seem like anything we were taught to aspire to in Sunday school either. If I go forward, God is not there, he says. Or backward, I can't perceive him. On the left he hides and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, but I can't see him. In the story of Job, a story explicitly told as this ultimate example of unshakable faith, one scene is of our hero saying, "Friends, I am miserable today, and I can't see God in my life anywhere at all." At the very least, we learn that the Bible's no L.L. Bean catalog. Not only are Job's clothes unsightly and filthy, his faith is in shreds and ashes as well, isn't it? So why in the world might Christians and Jews tell a story like this one to generation after generation? I realize we're not finished with it yet, but we are told over and over again throughout the book that Job was faithful through it all. So when we do drop into a scene from that life, we presumably get a glimpse of what faithfulness can look like at times. And apparently one picture of faithfulness is of a suffering man whose world seems to have been emptied of God. This may not seem like a terribly helpful image. Christians are supposed to be telling good news, right? But maybe one of the things the story of Job is meant to do for us is just diversify our religious friends. Maybe we do need to hear from people out at the edges of human experience for our faith to be deep and meaningful and real. The word religion is built from the same root as ligament. It's about binding things together. Perhaps what we're meant to do at a very basic level when we read a story like Job's in the Bible is to simply let our lives be bound to his. We simply call Job one of us and believe that in spite of all its bizarre details, his life might actually be relevant to ours in some way, or at least that his life might do something to ours. So we listen to him. We open ourselves to the possibility that even Job might be what a faithful Christian life can look like sometimes. And then we see what happens. Job's friends, you may remember, usually aren't remembered very kindly in this story. They're the ones who supposedly give him all the wrong advice, insisting that there must have been some grave sin that Job was forgetting that caused all this hardship. But listen to how these three friends first appear in the story. When they saw Job from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes, threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to them, for they saw that his suffering was very great. When Job's three friends saw him, they actually didn't start to explain anything. They didn't draw a lesson from anything. They didn't say anything at all until they had just wept with him and sat in silence for 7 days. Might we be called to make the same response to one another at times? To simply step out of our LL Bean or whatever catalog you prefer life and sit with the painful story of one other person, believing that our religion may not work on us most profoundly by giving us rules to live by as it does by simply binding our lives to other lives. I had a friend back in Arkansas who looked a lot like Job, at least as I imagined him. His name was Daryl. His clothes were usually soiled, torn. He'd park his bike in the narthex of the church several times a week and come in to pray. I know a few Daryls here in Memphis too, of course, but since we've been at Calvary for 7 years now, I feel like some kind of statute of limitations is up. Which allows me to also tell you that Daryl would walk into my office several times a week and say, "Hey, preacher, is secretary here? Because I want to put this $3 in. This is my church, you know." Secretary, whose real name was Carol Lou, and I used to resist Daryl's gifts. Frankly, I wanted him just to go buy a pair of pants, or at least a belt to keep them from falling down, as they did from time to time. But he wouldn't give in. So we let him give the church his money. Carol Lou would write his name on the envelope and seal it up tightly, which made him happy. And I should add that his gifts added up to several $100s over the course of a year. Now, Daryl's experiences in this life had been pretty different from mine. I never knew many of the particulars of his past, but I could see that he looked different from me. He smelled different. He thought differently. He spent his days differently. He prayed differently, spent his money differently. And it was his sheer persistence that kept me from ignoring him, wondering what his life could possibly have to do with a life like mine, keeping a safer distance. "This is my church," Daryl would say. And he was right. And I was changed a little bit every time he told me that. Every time he told me, and with $3 more to give away, I was changed. And so was my unspoken definition of church. Christian faith demands that we care for the poor and the downtrodden and the suffering. And I have no doubt that the folks back in Little Rock are still doing what they can for Daryl. But the story of Job draws us toward another truth about the ways of God in this world, I think. Because Job is actually not presented as someone who needs our help. He's presented up as a great exemplar of faith, a man of God, we're told. All we're really asked to do, I think, is let Job walk into our lives. Strange old Job, body covered with ashes, wondering if God's anywhere to be found in the world. Are we willing to let our religion bind up our lives with his? Are we willing to let this strange, brooding Hebrew stride into our midst and say, "This is my church"? You see, Jesus taught that the economy of grace is different from ours. Many who are first will be last, and the last will be first, we just heard him say. Things are upside down and backwards in this economy of grace. We think the way things work is that those who have something give to those who need something in this world. And then we meet Job, and everything turns around. We meet Job and see not that suffering has meaning or that God is its cause. Human suffering remains an inexplicable mystery to the end. What we do see is that absolutely no life is beyond the reach of God's belovedness in this story. And there's no telling what kind of life God might use to change ours. We get glimpses of this truth in all sorts of ways, all the time. Like once when a client leaving a counseling group Ardell used to lead suddenly looked up at her and he said, "You're one of us, aren't you?" And she saw he was right. And they were both a little changed. Grace comes to us this way all the time, does it not? If only we're given eyes to see it. So what if Christians came to be known not as those people who think they know how to fix everybody else in the world, but people who believe that we are changed as our lives are bound together with all kinds of other lives? Maybe even the lives of people who believe that faithfulness can look like hopelessness sometimes, that wealth can look like poverty, that the fullest life can look pretty empty. For if we really believed such things, imagine what sorts of lives we might let ours be bound up with. Imagine how we might look at one another and the rest of our world. Imagine how we might be changed a little right here at Calvary by every child of God who simply says to us in one way or another, "This is my church too, you know. This is my church."